Hi, welcome back. Hopefully everyone had a chance to get some lunch, nutritious lunch, and maybe take a look at some of the posters or visit the networking sessions. So we talked about earlier this morning how to train the next generation of precision nutrition researchers and scientists. Then we introduced some of the data analytics and computational approaches that can be used for precision nutrition. But technology, as I've mentioned, by itself is neither good nor bad. So as the title of a song in the past once said, it's in the way that you use it. So how do we actually use technology like artificial intelligence or machine learning or computer modeling? And how do we actually translate it to practice and policy? Well, Nico Pronk is going to start off this next section. So it's part 2 of section 5, talking about some of those issues and some of the challenges. And then we have the potential ethical conundrums that may arise from using different types of analytics. And Brendan Parent will be talking about that as well. So following the 2 presentations, we're going to have a panel discussion with some important folks within the related fields of data science, nutrition, and computational analytics. So hopefully you can join us for part 2 of section 5. So without further ado, I'll pass on the virtual mic to Dr. Pronk.
Hello, my name is Nico Pronk. I'm from the HealthPartners Institute in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'll be talking about translation and interpretation. As the agenda indicates, I'll be talking about 5 different areas in particular: deep knowledge and expertise, the 4 S's, leadership, dialogue, and stakeholder perspectives. From an interpretation and translation perspective, likelihood scenarios need to be translated into practical solutions that can be applied to real-world challenges. These efforts address bridging the gap between availability of systems models and their use. Bridging research, education, policy, and practice can be accomplished using a variety of approaches. For example, awareness and understanding of how systems work can be accomplished through training and education, or through the use of participatory approaches to model building, where the users or decision makers can see the impact of certain strategies on outcomes or identify where unintended consequences may surface. Several important challenges in translating evidence into practice to be highlighted include deep knowledge and expertise, the 4 S's, the role of leadership, the use of dialogue, and prospectively integrating a stakeholder perspective. Regarding deep knowledge and expertise, in order to interpret, understand, disseminate the knowledge generated by research, we need experts with deep knowledge that can explain these issues. Such expertise needs to come from multiple disciplines, including the fields of medicine, health, technology, engineering, and more. Such expertise needs to provide deep insights into the context of precision nutrition, including system science, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, machine learning, as well as areas critical to translation into practice, such as human-centered design, health communications. Furthermore, the strengths and limitations of the data need to be recognized through validation, including reliability testing. However, these efforts may not facilitate success in the absence of expertise in practical applications themselves. New ways of thinking need to be integrated into organizations where sustainable business models may be created to implement the solutions. As such, precision nutrition approaches need to integrate with areas of need, in essence, to reflect the areas of demand, such as obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and so on. Furthermore, to move from reduction of risk to promotion of health, such integration can move to enhance well-being, thriving, and flourishing. Next, the 4 S's. The 4 S's refers to a set of factors that is considered critical in the effort to move from research to practice, and really are organized from a practical perspective more than anything. First of all, size. Size of the effect refers to the magnitude, the extent, the relative aggregate amount, or number, or dose of the program, or intervention that impacts upon the user, thereby creating the desired effect, that is, effect size. Hence, size is a function of multiple aspects of intervention elements. The second S, scope, refers to the range of program operations and the extent of program activities. Program scope may also refer to the number of behaviors or risk factors that are being addressed. Defining scope is critical. It's critical to being able to cost the program and thereby understand how to apply resources in a responsible manner. The third S refers to scalability. Scalability refers to the ability of the program to follow a systematically timed, planned, and graded series of steps that cumulatively account for the continuously increasing reach of a program, until a critical mass is attained or the entire target population is engaged. Scalability is dependent upon multiple factors, including but not limited to the willingness of members of the target population to participate, the per unit cost of the intervention in the context of total resource availability, effective use of all available media to recruit and engage individuals, as well as the partnership potential with other stakeholders supporting similar goals. The last S is sustainability and refers to the long-term ongoing support for the program in relation to an accepted value proposition that balances allocated resources, such as time, money, people, or other available means, against generated revenues or benefits, and includes the confirmation of long-term program support through adequate proof of performance. In order to achieve sustainability, a program needs to involve all key stakeholders. It needs to allow for both input and feedback of those stakeholders, and systematically address program implementation, measurement, documentation, and monitoring of resource use. The next section is about leadership. Leadership is recognized as a critical element of organizational processes that support evidence-based dissemination and implementation. The role of leadership includes creating supportive work climates, positive attitudes towards implementation of evidence-based solutions, a commitment to organizational change, adapting to new conditions, and resonating with the interaction between internal and external environments and organizations. In particular, the creation of supportive organizational culture and climate is addressing systems changes at its deepest level, that is, changing deeply held beliefs, assumptions, values, and paradigms. Leaders who operate using a complexity lens tend to expand their ambitions through an open and external perspective, seeking to do good for their organizations and simultaneously to do well for the community, thereby ensuring social and societal benefit. More process-oriented is the role of dialogue. Structured dialogue may be an effective means by which to set the conditions that are right for translation of research into practice, dissemination of learnings and insights, and implementation of evidence-based solutions. Dialogue can be deployed as a technique to surface the most important human and organizational values that reflect what matters most for the people involved and in achieving organizational mission. Dialogue may also be used to communicate the connections between the change processes needed and the stakeholders involved in translational efforts. Furthermore, alignment is needed between organizational policies and practice and the identified values, beliefs, and attitudes. Dialogue is a powerful vehicle in helping to shape the culture needed to ensure successful translational work and ensuring that staff and those engaged in the work feel heard, respected, and engaged. And last but not least, stakeholder engagement. For translation to occur so that dissemination and ultimately implementation may successfully bring evidence-based solutions into practice, stakeholders' perspectives needs to be surfaced, needs to be considered, valued, and acted upon. Because different people perceive and experience the world in different ways, Stakeholders' perspectives may at times be similar and vastly different. Furthermore, any given stakeholder may hold various perspectives on the same system at various times. Perspectives should be gleaned from users, from physicians, from care teams, from payers, from policymakers, caregivers, as well as community agencies. In addition, points of view should consider the biological, the social, the financial, and the political context. So in conclusion, the interpretation and translation of system science approaches to precision nutrition calls for an appreciation of the physical, the social, and economic environments that modify the outcomes. There is a need to observe and summarize the strength of evidence of effectiveness and adapt such insights to the local marketplace using scalable and sustainable solutions, including business plans that allow for sustained implementation. Engagement of leadership from across multiple sectors in an ongoing dialogue could facilitate the creation of models that reflect an alternative way of thinking designed to simultaneously benefit society and business while mobilizing resources and activating funding mechanisms from both federal and private sources. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Bruce Lee and the organizers for the opportunity to present today on the ethics of artificial intelligence for precision nutrition. Quick disclosure slide. So precision nutrition has been around for quite a while already, as represented by the dietary guidelines for Americans put out by the United States Department of Agriculture. There are a number of socio-demographic factors which have been used to tailor recommendations for nutrition to individuals. Add to that nutrigenomics, proteomics, metabolomics, agrigenomics, and we get increasingly sophisticated recommendations that can save the healthcare system a lot of money and prevent disease. There are already a number of examples of this in play. Zevi and colleagues used a number of personal features to predict glycemic responses and then tailored dietary recommendations, which led to improved health outcomes. But there are a number of ethical questions that have to be answered throughout. And I hope to take us through some of those issues for artificial intelligence, then for AI for precision nutrition, and also some specific to precision nutrition itself. So the first concern has to do with consent. AI for precision nutrition will require research, and research will require subjects. And subjects have to agree to participate in this research, understanding the risks. So what are the risks of participating as a subject for AI research? It's that your health information goes to other people, and that might be sensitive information that you don't necessarily want them to have. So researchers are doing a lot to protect that information, which is very valuable, not only to researchers, but also to the pharmaceutical industry, to marketers, insurance companies, and hackers. But those security mechanisms are not always perfect, as represented by a number of data breaches that have occurred over the last 3 to 5 years, thousands of hospitals affected, and millions of healthcare records in the hands of people that you don't want to have that information. So the risks run from, well, I'd be embarrassed if you knew this about me, to insurance companies jacking up your rates when they are not allowed to do that, but might still do it, to individuals stealing your identity. So put all that aside, there is actually provision which says that if researchers adequately de-identify your health information such that it can't be traced back to you, they don't even have to ask your permission to use your health information in research. But there's a problem with this. Artificial intelligence has gotten sophisticated to the point where it takes very little information about you to re-identify you and trace that information to you. So we have a problem here, right? Is de-identification a fantasy? Are all of these hoops about getting consent to use your health information that's identified just an elaborate ruse, right? Do we need to abandon privacy? Before we get to that question, there has been this effort to move from specific consent to broad consent. It is an acknowledgement that health information is very important to improve science, medicine, nutrition, other endeavors. And the more people who contribute their information, the more powerful our AI systems can be to help in these fields. So the move suggests that when we ask for your consent to use your information for this research project, we might as well ask for your consent to future research projects so that we can share your data widely and contribute toward the betterment of science, medicine, and other endeavors. What is your recourse against this? Well, you could either choose to do it or say no. Those are the options now. You participate or you don't. Does this mean we abandon privacy? At this point, informed consent is nearly impossible because we don't really even know what's going to happen to your information if it's shared beyond the immediate research project. We don't really know or understand what the risks are. And maybe this is all under the assumption that the potential benefits outweigh the risks to such a degree that we should all just participate. And maybe the cat's already out of the bag, because if anyone has searched on social media, on Google, has shopped on Amazon, a lot of your sensitive information is already out there. And that is how sophisticated AI can re-identify you in a number of ways. But just because privacy might be dead-ish doesn't mean that consent has to be dead. In fact, it shouldn't be. It just needs to change. So maybe broad consent is the way of the future, but it needs significant disclaimers, i.e. we need to tell you as much as we know about what's going to happen to your data, and we need to tell you what we are going to do to protect it. And there are a lot of things that researchers already do to protect your personal health information. But maybe we need to focus on making those mechanisms better. We can use AI or maybe blockchain solutions to really ensure that your data isn't getting into the wrong hands, to monitor it and punish those who use it inappropriately. And if we do this, maybe we create an environment that supports science and research and also protects information adequately. So beyond permission, beyond security, let's talk for a moment about what data is being collected and what's being done with it. For algorithms to work, they need to be trained on data sets. But if that data is either erroneous in some ways or incomplete, it doesn't matter how good the algorithm is, the recommendations produced will either be unhelpful or maybe even harmful. At the same time, if your data is good, but your algorithm's logic is broken, or the programmers have injected such bias into it, then the recommendations, again, will not be helpful and may even be harmful. And there are a number of examples of this already in play. There's an algorithm widely used by a number of hospital systems to refer patients for nuanced critical care. And this algorithm was grossly disproportionately referring white people as opposed to black people. And when we discovered this, researchers went back and found that while white people and black people were spending approximately the same amount on healthcare, black people were far sicker. And the algorithm, without telling anybody, decided to use a much higher threshold to trigger this recommendation for nuanced care for black people, leading to worse health outcomes. So let's extrapolate this to precision nutrition context. There is a gene that manifests as poor ability to metabolize folate. Finding this gene, it would seem to make sense that we recommend you take a folic acid supplement, right? That could be programmed into an algorithm, and that could be one of the outputs. But what if there are uncharacterized genetic variants or gene copy variants that also bear on folate metabolism that might overcome the effects of that original variant? Or what if there are epigenetic factors, social determinants of health, that affect the proteome, metabolome, which also can either counterbalance or overcome that original gene variant? If either number one or number two are more represented in populations that are not adequately represented in the data set, or if the algorithm is not appropriately sensitized to number one or number two, then the recommendations could be harmful because taking too much folate, too much folic acid, can be harmful to the body. We also have to recognize that food is culture. Food is socially, relationally, emotionally relevant, and AI cannot ignore this. If protein, zinc, or iron deficiencies show up in the algorithm, chugging out a recommendation to eat more meat won't fly for vegans, won't fly for observers of particular religions, right? But we can't just program in whether the person is a vegan or Jewish or Muslim, because people who observe these religions or have these beliefs don't necessarily subscribe to all the tenets when it comes to their health or their nutrition. So it's complicated. And to make it even more complicated, racial diversity cannot be used as a proxy for genetic diversity when building your study population or your big data set. At the same time, race is relevant to the social determinants of health, which can have impacts epigenetically or on the proteome or metabolome. So what is the takeaway here? We need to clearly define the goals of the AI project, ensure that the data is collected in such a way that it is comprehensive, that all the variables that are relevant and bear on that goal are represented, and that the algorithm also supports those goals, and then test it before it gets released to the public and has impacts like the one we've seen regarding that hospital algorithm with racial bias. So it's the best way to do this is to ensure diverse stakeholders are involved in the development of the data set and the algorithm. Okay, so now we've talked about permissions, security, what data to collect, what to do with it. Once this information is available as recommendations, how do they get to individuals who can benefit from them? And to answer this question, we have to ask, when is precision nutrition the practice of medicine? This bears on the regulatory structures that exist and how the information can be delivered. For example, there is a test, a genetic test, for familial hypercholesterolemia, which, if you have the gene, you can be prescribed a diet that has lower cholesterol. This to me seems like the practice of medicine. Contrast that with this company called GenoPalette, whose tagline is "Eat for your genes," where you swab your cheek, you send in the DNA sample, and they provide you with a portfolio of guidance suggesting what genomic nutrition you need to eat to be the healthier version of you. So is this the practice of medicine? They don't have doctors delivering this information and supporting you through deciding what to do with these recommendations. But what if they tell you that you have a high tolerance for alcohol or caffeine, and then you make significant changes to your lifestyle that could bear on your health? Or what if they tell you you can't metabolize folate, but they're using an outdated genomic set of information about variants, which doesn't account for new findings, and then you overdose on folate? I think the answer should depend on what are the risks of following or not following the guidance that is provided. If this is not the practice of medicine, then the burden is on you as the consumer to prove that you were injured or harmed by the product or the recommendations. And while you might have a strong case, it's going to take strong legal arguments and a lot of money to get there. If this is the practice of medicine, the burden is on developers, manufacturers, etc., to show that this product is safe before it gets to you. Product recommendations, etc. At the research level, there are IRBs, institutional review boards, to protect human subjects. At the product approval phase, there's the Food and Drug Agency. And then once the recommendations are getting to you, there will have to be clinicians or some form of precision nutrition counselor to serve as a check on the results. But even so, these levels of security are not perfect. IRBs don't know how to handle the ethics of AI very often. I can speak from experience. The FDA hasn't really made a clear decision about whether AI software is a medical device for purposes of their purview and regulation. And clinicians might disagree with the recommendations put out from an algorithm. And then what is a patient supposed to do with this information when the doctor says, well, the computer says this, but I don't think you should be following these dietary recommendations, especially when the doctor might not be able to explain how the computer arrived at its conclusion. There's an argument that more testing, more oversight, by virtue of deeming a fair amount of precision nutrition as medical advice, means less access for populations who actually could benefit from this. Just let people spit in a tube and send it to GenoPalette, or have a mobile app where they can figure out what kinds of nutrition will be best for them. It's a good argument, but if the apps are broken based on biased logic, unrepresentative data sets, this could be harmful to people. And two, even if the recommendations are accurate, populations have to be able to act on them. They might get information to eat a particular kind of healthy set of produce, but if they live in a food desert, that's not going to work. Simultaneously, the proteome and metabolome change over time, so one and done recommendations will either be unhelpful or maybe harmful, and recommendations do not equal behavior modification. And there is some data to suggest that if recommendations are given in the context of the risk of disease, then people are more likely to follow those nutritional guidelines. So I'll end by saying that while the potential benefits of precision nutrition are immense, it is not just to pursue this endeavor without adequate attention to the populations who have the greatest to benefit and the greatest to lose in the design and delivery of these goods. Thank you very much.
Pause for a moment. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Brendan. We'll pause for a moment to allow our other panelists to join. All right, excellent. So very thoughtful presentations, lots to discuss. Before we get started on our panel discussion, and this is part 2 of section 5, which is really discussing the translation and the ethical considerations when taking AI, machine learning, data analytics, other types of computational analytics, and trying to translate it to research, to policy making, to decision making. You know, what are the opportunities and what are the potential challenges? So why don't we start off by having each of the members of our panel, our afternoon panel, introduce themselves, and then maybe give some thoughts about the topic. Some of you have also prepared some slides, so this will be your opportunity to go through some of the slides to start off the conversation. So I believe the first on deck is Dr. Segal. Would you like to introduce yourself and make some opening comments?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We heard some of your voice.
Oh, you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hi. So my name is Eran Segal. I'm a professor of computer science at the Weizmann Institute of Science. I've been working in the field of computational biology and machine learning for over 20 years. And in the past decade or so, my lab has been focused on personalized medicine approaches, mostly focusing on gut microbiome and nutrition. Several years ago, we did a large-scale study on 1,000 people who we connected to continuous glucose monitors and developed algorithms for predicting personalized blood glucose responses to meals based on clinical data and microbiome data for these participants. And we recently completed a randomized clinical trial in people with prediabetes, showing increased efficacy for our algorithm diet in lowering hemoglobin A1C and other glucose measures in these individuals.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Segal. Dr. Spector, would you like to introduce yourself? And I believe you have a few slides that you would like to show. Dr. Spector, I don't think we can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear now.
So I'm an MD and genetic epidemiologist, and have been heading the Department of Twin Research and Epidemiology at King's College London for the last 25 years. And like Eran, I've got interested in computational methods of looking at microbiome and metabolism. And for the last 3 years, I've set up this program of studies with other groups in the US, such as Harvard and Stanford, and a company called Zoe, a biotech company, to do large-scale studies of personalized nutrition. Next slide, please. And this led to a couple of publications this year, which people can look up. One in June, which basically allowed us to look at around 1,000 twins, and told us that genes, everyone was unique in their response to food. Genes were only a small fraction of the explanatory variables, and explained virtually none of our fat responses, and that how and when we can impact our response to food. And dissecting this using AI methods is now achievable with around 80% precision using by giving people standard meals and then working out from that how they would respond to other foods. Next slide, please. And just yesterday we published this paper looking at the metagenome side of our data, showing the importance of the microbiome on our responses to food. Again, more important than our genes. And we are able to, for the first time, really show a link between good and bad microbes with food patterns and markers of health. And this allows us to start using the microbiome in a more informed way in these algorithms. And because the microbiome is so unique to all of us, much more so than our genes, this offers great possibilities for future use of nutrition. And we're getting more data because with the company Zoe, we are now collecting tens of thousands, going to hundreds of thousands of people who are participating in research so we can combine these results. So it's a very exciting time at the moment in personalized nutrition. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Spector. And Dr. Horn, would you like to introduce yourself? And I believe you have some slides as well. We can't quite hear you, Dr. Horn.
Okay, now my audio has been unmuted.
Yes.
Great.
We hear you now.
Great. So, yes, I'm Abigail Horn. I'm currently a research associate in the Department of Preventative Medicine at the University of Southern California. My background is in systems thinking, and I have a Ph.D. in engineering systems from the Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT. And so I wanted to say a few words about utilizing novel data streams for whole systems precision nutrition research. And so over the past few days, and maybe not in the previous two sessions, but in earlier sessions today and yesterday, we've had many speakers discussing the importance of the system level effects on nutrition as part of the much larger system of systems that affects nutritional choices and behavior. And so a central framework for conceptualizing the many system levels and conditions that influence food choices is the ecological model, which I'm showing in this slide, which emphasizes the key systems that individuals are embedded within and that influence their eating behaviors. So beyond the individual, we have the social and sociocultural levels that impact them. the physical and spatiotemporal environments in which it's embedded, and the macro level policy and industrial environments that determine what's available. And so while this system model has helped to shape the more holistic approach that researchers and study designs have taken to investigate drivers of nutritional patterns and behaviors, it is missing some of the multifaceted conditions that determine exposure and behavior that interact with nutrition. So in particular, there are key complex system features that this model doesn't address that include interaction effects, dynamics over time, secondary and tertiary effects, and emergent properties. So a lot of this Bruce discussed in his opening remarks as well. So with all of this, there is great opportunity to better measure, monitor, and model the multifaceted system-level influences on nutrition and health by utilizing novel data streams and novel data science methods to study these system-level interactions. So when I think about novel data streams, I think mostly about data that's passively sensed, or as it's called, collected in the wild. But these kind of data sources can also be captured purposefully within the design of the study. So some of the data sources that I'm more familiar with and that can be used for precision nutrition are mobility data, social media data, transactional data, which can be records of credit card transactions or retail or shopper food cards, and logistics, trade, and delivery data. And all these data sources have a number of advantages for measuring food environment exposures and eating behaviors, including they allow measuring across large and diverse samples and passive and continuous automatic data collection. But I really want to emphasize that they can capture these system-level features of exposure and behavior, including dynamic representations across time and space and interaction effects. So, for example, an individual living who does not live in a food desert, but spends most of their time throughout the day in neighborhoods that are food deserts or environments that are food deserts, they might not have the opportunity to access the kind of food that would be deemed healthy, and so they would. It's really important to be able to look at those entire exposures, the entire set of their exposures, and not just limiting it to a single static measure. So Dr. De La Haye already mentioned some of the work that our group is doing to use mobility data, the smartphone geolocation data, to study these exposures throughout an individual's daily course, moving beyond the home neighborhood. In another project, we're using logistics, trade, and delivery data to model the network structure of the aggregated food supply system across the multiple levels of production, processing, trade, and consumption. And these kind of system-level models of the supply chain can be useful for understanding the industrial and infrastructural systems that determine where and how food is grown, processed, produced, and consumed, which thereby helps to determine where individuals can access foods, and determining where the provenance of food, where food comes from, and the chemical or biological exposures that it could have had along its course of action. So with all of these, novel data streams can help to advance precision nutrition research by moving beyond static average measures of exposure and behavior to capture dynamic representations across time and space. And I want to emphasize that these are layers of data that can be used in combination with existing study designs to capture some of the system level effects that contribute to an individual's dietary response.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. And next up is Dr. Peng. Would you like to introduce yourself and offer some opening comments?
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and thank you to the organizers for a fantastic meeting. So my name is Grace Peng, and I am a program director at the National Institutes of Health in the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, otherwise known as the NIBIB. And my programs are to promote mathematical modeling, simulation, and analysis at the NIH, at the NIBIB. I'll be mentioning a lot of acronyms and program names, so if you want to just jot down my email, it's my first name dot last name at nih.gov. So grace.peng at nih.gov if you have any questions. So basically, for the mathematical modeling program, I promote a lot of mechanistic model development to understand the body across multiple spatial temporal scales of the biological, biomedical, and behavioral systems. And I wear another hat where I chair the Interagency Modeling and Analysis Group, otherwise known as IMAG, and we coordinate the Multi-Scale Modeling Consortium. And this consortium really talks about methods to cross scales, address sparse data, address uncertainty, develop methods for developing credible models. So I would encourage you to take a look at our IMAG wiki. You just go to the browser and type in IMAG space wiki and you'll find it. My simulation program is about using mathematical and statistical methods to emulate processes in the biomedical world to reduce medical errors and increase patient safety. So essentially developing medical simulators for performance training for our practitioners. And so if you think about it, there's a lot of hard math and stats involved in emulating some of these high fidelity simulations. For my analysis program, we're interested in using math and stats to develop complex methods for analyzing data, such as data in the brain. And I'm very much involved in the NIH Brain Initiative. And that's where we're really interested in using next generation machine learning tools and AI to promote the integration of brain theories and integrating conceptual theories of the brain. I'm also involved in the NIH HEAL initiative, which is helping to end addiction long term, and understanding lower back pain, the backpack program. So a lot of what was discussed in this meeting so far covers a lot of what NIH is interested in doing. I am in particular involved in a new AI program at the NIH that we're starting up. We're calling it Bridge to AI, and that program is actually to promote the development of well-defined and, as we heard in the previous session, unambiguous data sets for next generation artificial intelligence approaches. And in particular, to interweave ethics, which we just heard in the previous talk, into the processes in which the data are created, as well as the analysis that will be done later. So again, I'm promoting system science approaches. A lot of the programs that I talked about are promoting a lot of consortium-based activity to create guidelines and standards for developing credible models. If you go to the IMAG wiki, you'll find we just published the 10 simple rules for developing credible models, and we're hoping that people will use it in all of their processes. If you think about the rules, you'll find that the first rule is to define the context of your model or the data set that you're talking about. Second rule is using appropriate data. Third rule is evaluating within the context of the data and the end use. To list your limitations is the fourth rule, and to use version control is the fifth rule. These rules are very obvious rules when you think about it, but if you think about using these processes in your approaches throughout your process, you'll be able to standardize and increase the credibility of the models. We're actually implementing it also to look at the current COVID-19 models, to also assess credibility practices for COVID model development. So I guess in terms of this community, I would say the next grand challenge for this community is to create the well-defined, unambiguous data for integrating social and behavioral models, and to address ethics in your data collection and your algorithm development. I would strongly encourage you to think about doing that. Again, my email is grace.peng@nih.gov, and you're welcome to contact me. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Peng. Dr. Peng has been instrumental in really pushing multi-scale modeling and multi-scale approaches, talking about really looking at all the different scales, ranging from the biological scale up to broader scales like the environmental scale, et cetera. So definitely want to come back to that during our panel session and discuss how to integrate that into precision nutrition. Perhaps we can start off with some questions for Nico and Brendan, since they kicked off with their presentations. And in fact, there are some leftover questions from the previous section that are actually more appropriate, or they're appropriate for the previous section, but they're also appropriate for this section as well. So maybe I can lead off with a couple of those questions from the audience. So one was, as academic researchers develop new technologies through team science, often including several different universities to bring in different expertise, what is the role of tech transfer, the tech transfer office? Are these systems patentable, and how do precision nutrition teams navigate potential commercialization? Dr. Pronk, I was wondering if you could lead off with a response to that.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Yeah, I think that is a very appropriate question for this session. And certainly I think tech transfer offices within university systems are very well positioned to bridge the connection into the broader community. And there are certainly examples of those transfer offices that also patent the innovations that are being generated within academic systems. So I would certainly agree with that approach. And particularly, I would say that effective transfer offices do work very closely with their community partners. And they bring them in. They bring them into dissemination and implementation studies to actually test the effect of those innovations into real-world situations. And in and of themselves are a good example of activities that allow multiple stakeholders to come together and be part of a solution going forward. So yeah, I would definitely think that that's an appropriate way to think about the work that's being done in an academic setting and to connect that into solutions for practice.
And then this is a broader question that also came up during the last session. How have you considered policy design and policy making in the process of conducting related research? So that was specifically to the panelists from the previous section, but it's a good springboard to discuss that in general. To both of our presenters, our initial presenters, what are your responses to that question?
Maybe I can start off okay. So I would say that, again, much like in my presentation, it is so important to bring stakeholders together when you do this translational work. And particularly in the context of making decisions that are related to policy, you need to get policy makers and policy shapers engaged in that process early on. Much like avoiding the worry of a black box, if these efforts can be understood and that the applications of them are clear in terms of the potential limitations they may have, people understand the implications of making a decision based on algorithms or models that come out of this work. If they understand that early on, they're part of that discussion and the dialogue, they can make informed decisions going forward. So particularly from a policy perspective, incredibly important, but also from a product design perspective, similarly.
And the only thing I'll add, yes, absolutely. The only thing I'll add is we're late, right? I think policy can be implemented too early, right? When we actually don't know what the implications are of the tools. And we might have seen some examples of this with, I won't name states, but California implementing certain regulations of, artificial intelligence that might overly restrict some things without actually understanding what's happening. But now that this is going full force, I think we probably need federal level guidance. And as Nico is saying, they need to be at the table when decisions are being made to actually understand what the tools are.
Brendan, that raises an interesting question. So, of course, you outlined very eloquently all the ethical issues involved in developing AI approaches, et cetera. So it is helpful in terms of understanding potential bias, how these things are constructed. Yet there's also the tug of commercialization, and that there's many companies or many researchers might have other reasons to basically keep their algorithms proprietary and maybe not necessarily release them to the world. So where do we find that balance? Because after all, there are practical concerns when people want to continue research programs or scientific programs.
So a disclaimer before I answer, I'm good at helping ask the questions, not coming up with the answers. So I will just second what you are proposing and point out that there are absolutely benefits and risks to both models, right? Monopolization, commercialization, you have control of the system, you know what's going into it, you can continue to tinker with it and understand what's going on, but then that limits perhaps the size of the data set or the information that goes into it, the number of checks that can be performed on the implementation of the algorithm. There needs to be a little bit of both, I would say.
So Dr. Peng, going back to the idea of multi-scale modeling and multi-scale approaches, one of the challenges is that we're very siloed as a society, both in terms of content, but also in terms of scale, right? So there are people who research at the cellular level, and people who do research at the individual person level, and then broader than that. What are your thoughts in terms of how do we break down those silos? I mean, you've mentioned some great programs and initiatives, but how do we do that across society? Because of course, the organization of universities and companies and what have you are also many times specific by scale.
Right. I think it's a huge problem, and by nature, people are comfortable with the scale, if you may, at which they work. But I think in the earlier session, when the emphasis was on understanding the problem, if you truly want to understand the problem, you'll soon realize that the problem incorporates a system that has multiple scales. You just can't address the problem at a single scale. So once you start with the problem and divide it down into the tasks, you'll realize that you really do need to address the problem at multiple scales. So you may be at the behavioral level, but you need to reach below the skin, so to speak, to get to the molecular level or the tissue level to really try to address the problem you're trying to address. Technologically, I think people are developing more and more mathematical and statistical computational techniques to bridge those scales, both spatial and temporal scales. So I think we can get there. I think, again, it's all about defining the problem.
So focusing on problems and basically understanding the questions of interest. So Dr. Spector, there's a question from the previous session that may be best directed to you. So this is the question. Someone mentioned that he or she is a Ph.D. student working on AI-assisted healthcare, specifically food computational models. This is an open question to all. What are some of the important challenges that the medical field tries to address in nutrition estimation? And are there any research to estimate food volume? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, you could take an hour to answer that question. So, yeah, I mean, the problem we've had so far is we've been trying to oversimplify food, and we've got obsessed with calories and macronutrients, and this has really been why we've been held back for the last 20 years. And so I think we have to realize the complexity of food, and one of the ways, and accept that there are problems with the food frequency questionnaire that just gives you a rough idea of what's going on, but the strategy we've taken is to say, well, the only way to deal with this is to give people experiments where you know exactly what they're eating and see their responses to that, and then use that information to train your data sets to see how they would then react in real life. Because food is so complex that we're never going to get an accurate estimate on asking people what they eat. And so we get much better results, as Eran studies, 5 years ago and now ours are showing that you can predict these responses in individuals to standardized meals in ways that you couldn't possibly do just by taking historical meals and estimating portion sizes, etc. So I think people can, for a short while, do weighing and photographing their food, and we have found that if that's done through an app, that it is a good way of actually measuring things in the short term, but it's never going to work long term, or not unless we get some great new technology to make it effortless to actually record what people are eating. So I think the key is to move away from the historical questionnaire-based, estimate plate size-based methods that have, and then divided, and then the areas of macronutrients, and move towards this new way of looking at food in a more dynamic system where you can control the experiments. And now we've shown that we can do these experiments at scale with tens of thousands of people doing these home tests where you can measure blood glucose with glucoses, you can measure fat changes, inflammation changes with blood spots, and you've got metabolomics coming in to help with that, as well as the microbiome, and both as an input and an output into that system. So I think it's just looking at nutrition in a totally different way, rather than trying to fix something that is in a way not really fixable.
Thank you, Dr. Spector. And Dr. Segal, so you've done a lot of work with looking at different levels of gene regulation, and you've looked at the microbiome, et cetera. So I'm going to ask you a question that's come up actually frequently during these 2 days is, yeah, so these are complex systems, but how do you decide what to collect? How do you decide what to look at? Because ultimately it could just get overwhelming in terms of what to collect and what information to gather.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I guess we don't know in advance what to collect before we look at the data. So in fact, in our studies, in the initial study, we decided to go very broadly and really collect a very broad and comprehensive phenotype. So that included microbiome and genetics and blood tests and questionnaires that people filled out and metabolomics that we've done. So I think that, in my view, would be the best approach initially when you're when you don't know what would give you the best signal, and then after you do the initial work on a large cohort that where you have all of the parameters together, then in the second stage you can narrow it down. So, for example, we recently published a paper. It looks somewhat similar to something that Tim Spector showed in his presentation now, where we analyzed blood serum metabolites, and we also had this very broad collection of panel of diet and microbiome and genetics and many other factors. And so when you have all those factors together, you can ask for each metabolite, what is the layer of information that is best at determining or statistically explaining that metabolite. And then we could partition the metabolites on those to those that could best be explained by diet, others could best be explained by genetics, and others by microbiome, another by time of day, another by gender and age, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be the best approach when you don't have prior knowledge on what would be the most likely determinant.
Thank you, Dr. Segal. And Dr. Peng, what is the role in terms of, we talk about specific data models, but there's also conceptual models. What role does that play in terms of developing or better understanding the complex systems?
So I think it's really important for people in addressing a problem to start with conceptual models. Conceptual models you can think of as the back of the napkin model that you came up with in the middle of the night when you had a brainstorm, right? And usually those kinds of concept ideas start with an idea, and you might have inputs and outputs, but you can really broaden what was just discussed into all the different factors that contribute to this very complex system if you just break it down into the different concepts and you link the inputs and outputs. And from there, you can actually identify where the gaps are in the data and the models and what needs to be studied and develop testable hypotheses from there to really create a more systems approach to addressing the gaps and the needs of the problem at hand. So I would certainly encourage people to start with models to drive your experimental design, and conceptual models would be a great place to start.
Excellent point, Dr. Peng. So this next question, so I'm actually turning to some of the audience questions right now. This question specifically said, this question is for Dr. Parent, but it's actually, I think it may be applicable across the panel, but Brendan, I'll let you answer this first. Given the analytic rigor of some of the technologies used to query biological information related to precision nutrition is still not optimized, how should we interpret the AI inferences of data from such technologies? So I think this is something that everyone can chime in, but since it's directed to Dr. Parent, I would like you to address it first.
Let me just start by abdicating the term doctor. I'm an attorney, I'm a professor, but I do not deserve that lauded title as basically.
We'll call you Professor Parent.
So I'll take whatever. Brendan,
okay.
My answer to that question is with a massive grain of salt. We have to be very wary of the output. That said, I absolutely support and advocate for the design, testing, research. But once it's actually on the market, I think we need required communication tools to ensure that no one over relies on the inferences too early. And I'll stop there.
Dr. Pronk, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I would agree with Brendan on this, and I would say that this is one of those situations where, in the back of our minds, we got to keep focus on trust. In order for us to generate trust among the recipients of research, we need to be sure that this is linked to an understanding and awareness of the interpretation of these models as well. So and that actually should be complemented by a clarity about the results themselves. What do these models actually show, and do they show truth? So this is where I think testing in terms of validation and reliability testing becomes so important before you actually send these results out into the marketplace.
Dr. Horn, I think you're also well positioned to answer this question because you not only are steeped in the analytics, but as your presentation showed, you're also heavily involved with interacting with decision makers and the policy issues as well. So I was curious to see what your response to this question might be.
Yeah, I think where my mind goes first, because my research focuses a lot more on the food environment, is just the lack of analytic rigor that we currently have in this sphere, and how, hearing Dr. Spector talk about the challenges with being able to measure an individual's nutritional intake, and yes, we can capture photographs of that, and eventually we'll be able to do a good job analyzing those photographs. We're not quite there yet with the state of deep learning, but there are challenges there. But if you think about the food environment, the way that we characterize someone's exposures that I mentioned and that other people have mentioned in previous talks is their neighborhood or is their environment a food desert or not? Is it a food swamp or not. And it's just not as black and white as that. And kind of like in some of what I was trying to emphasize in some of my opening comments, you know, someone might live in a food desert for part of their day, but they spend a lot of their day in some place that's very abundant with different opportunities. And so being able to see those, you know, the spatiotemporal dynamics of where an individual is and understanding that needs to be a part of the picture. And so we really need to do, there's so much opportunity for really digging into measuring better characterizing the food environment with more analytical rigor. And I think just a similar, on a similar note, talking about the policy integration, some of the, you know, a lot of the early interventions that we've had relating to the food environment, for example, a number of studies to build a supermarket in a neighborhood that is a food desert, to keep on with the example. There's very mixed evidence on the effectiveness of these kind of interventions. And, you know, I think we hypothesize that that could very likely be due to the fact that, you know, we're not accurately characterizing where you know, what are all of the system level impacts that determine an individual's nutritional choices. And it's not just the neighborhood that they live in, but it's the places they spend time throughout the day. It's the people that they spend time with, and it's other accessibility topics. And so, having the right kind of community partners is one thing, but really, I think a question that is really, really difficult is when is the right time to deploy an intervention or deploy a policy when I think how are you testing these things? Dr. Parent talks a lot about like test in different settings. And, you know, how do we test some of these things that we don't have a lot of data on to test them on? We can implement these interventions and we can get community partners involved and on board. But, you know, what's the right time to act? How do we know when that is? So I guess I'll end my responses there with another question.
One thing that was striking from your slides, you know, you show some visualizations. In terms of, you know, some visualizations of data and the results. Maybe you could speak a little bit about, you know, the importance of visualizations in terms of translating results or translating what data analytic or model is doing.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about, and to respond to that, I'd like to talk about a vision that I have that we haven't gotten there yet, but with some of what we call the food mobility work, where Dr. De La Haye spoke about it in more detail. We have the geolocation records of 700,000 individuals in Los Angeles County over the course of a 6-month period, and we can every 5 minutes or so we have their location tracked, and we can use this to determine their exposures and see how those exposures and environment relate to different eating decisions that they've made. And so we're really trying to, you know, this is a big project to analyze this kind of data, and where we want to go with this is use the understandings that we develop from analyzing this data to be able to develop environmental interventions that would be tailored to certain types of populations, subpopulations, or, you know, going down to the individual level if that's possible, but environmental interventions. And the vision is that, you know, it's always very important to have visuals to be able to communicate the impact of certain of science, but the impact of interventions that they could have on a community. And so so the idea is that we could build a 3D model that could show for Los Angeles, where our study is based, what our environment currently looks like, and what it could look like when it's transformed in these interventions, and we can simulate movements across this 3D model. And I've seen some really great stories come out of working stakeholders together at a table around a 3D model like this, where everyone can see and test out different simulation strategies. That really brings it to the next level. So that's kind of the vision that I have for where our project could go. And just to conclude, that having these visuals is really important to be able to involve stakeholders and show the potential impacts of what you're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. This next question I'd like to direct towards Dr. Spector. It's from the attendees. This person is asking, how soon can we expect precision nutrition counseling referrals from our medical providers? Can you share any targeted resources in that direction as a reference, meanwhile? So how far do you think we are from the realization of quote-unquote precision nutrition? And then that also depends on how you're defining precision nutrition as well.
I think Eran can speak to this because the company that he's working with have a specific focus on nutrition for diabetes, which is, I think, getting close to that. Most of the contacts I've had are through the company that I work with, Zoe, who are in contact with a number of these health providers. But I think there's a lot of discussions going on at the moment. I see this happening within the next couple of years. And it might start on a limited scale with people with specific conditions. But once people can see that there's compliance with the system, that having paid your several $100s or whatever it is to start and get your advice, they can see some compliance, then I think they will start to be interested, and it will start to be compared to other, for example, weight loss programs that some of them already are paying money for. So I'm fairly optimistic this will happen in the next couple of years, but it will be a slow program. It's not going to happen all at once. I think it's going to come in certain avenues to get it going. But there's absolutely no reason, because I think even if you didn't believe the science, this is a very good way of getting people more interested in the food they're eating. Scenario that these algorithms don't work, it still interests people much more in the effects of the food that's having on their bodies. And so if people kept with that program, generally they would be healthier. But I'm sure Eran and I both believe these algorithms do work, and we've got good evidence now they do and can help people lose weight. And so I think within a couple of years, this is going to be fairly mainstream, and people will start to get various health providers paying for them.
Dr. Segal, thoughts? We can't quite hear you. I think your mouth is moving, but okay, there we go.
Yeah. So the company that licensed our technology called Day2, they actually were successful in being adopted by our two largest medical organizations here. So we have 4 in total. One oversees over half the population, and it adopted the technology and offers it at a subsidized rate, including providing dietary consultation with dietitians to accompany the product, which always is a good thing and helps. And I think they've been seeing excellent results, both in terms of weight loss in the general population and improvement in diabetes parameters in pre-diabetics and type 2 diabetic patients. And the second healthcare or largest healthcare organization here also recently adopted the technology. It's also offering it at subsidized rates, and currently it's only offered for type 2 diabetes patients. And this just started, so, but I believe since this is all within the Israel locale, and there's a high similarity between the people who are in both health organizations, I believe it'll also show good results. I think penetration to the US is a bit more challenging, and it typically starts with pilot projects, and if successful, then they can move on to more advanced stages. So like Tim said, I think that'll still take a couple of years, but in Israel, it's actually been very successful and really widely adopted by the health organizations.
So thanks, Dr. Segal. So tying the last two questions together, the how ready are we in terms of precision nutrition, and then how do we deal with the uncertainty? Dr. Peng, maybe you could mention some of the approaches or practices that can be useful in helping determine how ready for prime time a lot of these approaches might be.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Lee. I think, I think we mentioned commercialization and translation and the processes that people need to go through to address the market value for any of these products that you think that you'd like to produce. But I think in terms of understanding the rigor of the approaches and the readiness, everything can always be improved, right? And so the 10 simple rules that I talked about previously in terms of credible practice and developing models is really about being transparent about what we know and what we don't know right now and who it's applied to. And the number one rule, again, is the context of use. So if I were an end user of one of these products, perhaps counseling me on the types of food I should eat, I should want to understand the limitations of that product or the context in which that product is developed for making the particular advice that it's producing. So I would say having this credible practice throughout your process and making what's known and not known transparent to the end user will determine the rigor and the readiness. And so as a user, I would understand, well, they may not understand how it might help me in this factor, but maybe it might help me for this factor. So that's where I think credible practice throughout the process will be really important.
Thank you, Dr. Peng. So another question from the attendees. From your presentation, Professor Parent, would you recommend testing algorithm-generated data in clinical trials prior to implementation?
Yes.
Yes? Any further words?
I mean, obviously, I think nuance is required. You have to, what's being tested, what is the end goal. But personally, yes. I'm trying to think of an example when that wouldn't be beneficial, and I'll turn to the other participants for pushback.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. More testing is a good idea before you go into clinical trials. At the same time, though, I would say that, as we see examples of early development of programs that are ready for clinical trials. So, for example, digital twin studies, seeing an opportunity to do some comparative effectiveness type of trials would be a good idea. But certainly before large-scale implementation as a solution that is, for example, covered under a medical benefit. We need a lot more trials before that happens. I think there's also a question around, we've been talking a lot about precision nutrition, obviously, during these past 2 days. But there is also a bridge, if you will, that needs to move from nutrition to food. So can the precision nutrition work that is being researched translated effectively into food-specific solutions for people in the real world, and do the results hold when you make that shift? And that's another, one of those challenges that needs to be explicit before you go too far.
Thank you, Dr. Pronk.
Can I just play devil's advocate? Just say, do we really need clinical trials to show that genetics isn't going to work? Every geneticist will tell you that the amount explained by genes that we know about or foods, with a few exceptions of maybe, milk and coffee, are trivial, are tiny. So they can't work. So having to, so in a way we should be able to triage some of these already to say that they can't be generalizable approaches when you can take a model like twins, or you can do sequencing, whichever you prefer, and you can see that they can't possibly explain more than a tiny fraction of a % of what's going on. So, I think that we shouldn't treat them all the same. I think there's some ones that are logical, and anyone sensible knows that there's multiple factors you need to put into any model. It can't just be one. And then, of course, everyone would like to do a clinical trial, but who's going to pay for them all? Is it going to be a 3-year trial of reducing new diabetes or weight loss? Or will you take a surrogate trial of markers, that you can do in 3 months? These are the subtleties, I think, here. But I think we all agree on some form of clinical trial once you've got your model working to show it. But the expense is enormous. And at the moment, a lot of the companies that are helping develop these products don't have hundreds of millions to spend on these trials. And so there's going to have to be some compromise here about what level of evidence you would require that doesn't meet a pharmaceutical type product.
That's a very very interesting and good point, Dr. Spector. So, the question is, can these computational approaches actually help also decide when trials are necessary and how should they be designed? We shouldn't necessarily automatically always default to some of the prior paradigm. Any other thoughts about that? In terms of how computational analytics then fits into this whole milieu of traditional epi studies, clinical studies, benchtop research, etc.
If I can chime in, I'll just say that ideally you can use computational models to simulate as far as you can, to the point where as you mentioned in your talk, Dr. Lee, that you can have synthetic data where you can predict the effects on synthetic populations, to the point where you can use the simulation to really hone in on a very focused study on what you actually need to do it on real people. So I think simulation and modeling is really important to do prior to actually planning the clinical trial that you do in real people.
Which would certainly reduce costs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
how far are we from? So Professor Parent, you had mentioned FDA and how they're viewing AI and other types of analytics. So at what point do we get to a point where some of the traditional trial methods can be replaced by computational approaches?
I think we're getting close, and I'll have to modify something. I made it sound like in my presentation like FDA has just thrown their hands up and covered their eyes, and they haven't done exactly that. There's actually been a lot of rigorous thought going into how to reconceptualize the path to market for software as a medical device. And I would assume that even though there is a lower regulatory bar from the FDA perspective for wellness products, that there will still be hopefully some additional oversight that is for the life cycle of the product, the product, to ensure that it remains low risk or, pre-medical in terms of the product. And so I hope that in the coming months that we will see policy that is more appropriately tailored to the dynamicism of AI products for precision nutrition.
And if I can just add, we've mentioned FDA, but oftentimes we forget about CMS and reimbursement issues. And oftentimes when people apply for grants or funding, they're considering the FDA pipeline, but not necessarily the reimbursement pipeline. And both need to actually work and be successful in order to truly translate and commercialize. So I would really encourage people to think about both. And it's all wrapped into the whole idea of market value and commercialization and how you see it used in the market.
Excellent point. Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services really determines how things are reimbursed. So that will determine a lot in terms of whether something reaches the market and how much financial return it might get. So excellent point. Another question from the attendees. This is specifically for Dr. Horn. Let's say you are conducting a traditional nutrition study in Los Angeles, where the entire cohort lives in Los Angeles. Is it useful to include novel data streams in one study? Would people in the same city really have really different environments?
Yes, I'm so glad this question was asked, because this is really what I wanted to emphasize, is that yes, absolutely, we can leverage these data sources to help us understand there is immense diversity within Los Angeles in particular. That's what we are focused on currently with our research, and there is immense diversity in the types of food environments that people have and the types of exposures that people have along their daily path. So if we were to come up with an average measure of what's the food environment in Los Angeles, it would definitely not work there's no average Los Angelino. There is incredibly diversity in the populations and in the environment. And what I was trying to emphasize earlier a bit is that even if we use an existing measure, for example, the USDA has an index of which neighborhood, which census tract is a food desert. That would tell us that something like Malibu is a food desert, but Malibu is maybe a food desert, but the overwhelming majority of the population in that neighborhood have cars, they have transportation access, and they are able to access high quality food environments. And we could see that if we track their mobility along the day. So this is why I'm trying to say that we really need to be able to measure the individual environments that individuals have, the different environments that individuals are exposed to and inhabit and can access. And two, we can really use these novel data streams to do that, to advance the precision of how we are measuring these environments. So thanks for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. The next question is, could you say more about digital twins in research?
I think I was the one that brought that up. So there is an emerging research literature that starts to look into digital twins for the purposes of, for example, dealing with nutrition-related aspects of managing diabetes or the impact on obesity. And so as those studies are starting to come out, they tend to be small studies. They tend to be sort of the beginning, the starting point of a portfolio that is needed. So I would say, it's an emerging area of research, and it's getting pretty close to being tested in clinical trials. but most of the studies appear to be coming out of other countries than the US.
If I can chime in, I mentioned the IMAG Multi-Scale Modeling Consortium. We actually had a meeting on developing digital twins by integrating machine learning and mechanistic models. And for those of you who aren't familiar, digital twins are common in the manufacturing world, where there are twins of cars, planes, trucks. And the idea of having digital twins for healthcare is real-time monitoring of us, a twin of me, a twin of you, so that you can predict what happens to you in tomorrow or in 30 years. And the whole thing is based on the ability to monitor things in real time, and wearables and lots of wearable sensors that can monitor our activities. So I think that is the future of health, is real-time health, rather than having you visit your doctor once a year. You actually are monitoring yourself on a real-time basis. And that's where AI can really come in to figure out where is the needle in the haystack in terms of this extreme amount of data streams that are being collected for each person.
Thank you, Dr. Peng, Dr. Pronk. So there's a couple questions here, which I think opens up a whole new area of discussion. So I'm going to combine these two questions. The first one is, how do we ensure that technologies facilitate dietitians but not replace their roles in the long run? And another one is, how can AI compensate for the interpersonal relationship between the nutritionist and the client? A big part of the nutritionist's job is the ability to listen and to bridge where clients stand nutritionally and where they want to be. So how can we add this idea to precision nutrition? So this goes hand in hand with some of the concerns that AI and computational analytics may, quote unquote, replace what people do. And we've seen this in other fields where there might be a delay in the advance of computational approaches because there is that concern that that will actually end up making people lose their jobs and lose their livelihood. So I wanted to start with Dr. Spector to see what your reaction to that might be, and how do we ensure that AI and other types of approaches can work with people as opposed to not work with people.
I think the key to this is to ensure that the information you're giving them is still providing them choices, so that you never say to anyone, you have to eat this, you can't eat this. It's just giving them more information so they're still in charge of their choices. And I think this is the key to compliance, so that people can still eat the worst thing on the menu. You just tell them that, this is, of those 100 foods, the worst thing you can eat. I really wouldn't have too much of it. But in the end of the day, it's still their choice. So I think this seems to be the way most of the companies that have apps are going, like in our studies with the Zoe app. And we're not finding it a problem because, most of the people who are dealing this seriously are saying to everyone, you can have whatever you like, just have it at different prices. And I don't think we're doing anything that's going to kill people or put nutritionists out of jobs or do anything that's going to change it. And I think these sort of tests are going to enhance the advice that health professionals can give as well. So I think it's the only people who might be put out of business are the people who make the labels on foods that tell you you've only, it's all about calories and percentage of saturated fat, because all these AI methods are telling people, actually, this is your own personal label. Forget what's on the packet. This is what you should be listening to. It's, this is how your body's going to respond with sugar. This is how it's going to respond in terms of the fat, inflammation, etc. So I think I don't see it as a problem. I think these are aids. They're not replacing anything really. They're replacing perhaps FDA guidelines about and food pyramids and food plates. Maybe those people will go out of business, but I don't think anyone else will.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Segal, do you have any thoughts in that, and how does it affect the translation of your research or the explanation of your research?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Tim, and I think, as I mentioned before, I think in the end, I think the algorithms and technology is really good. It's really useful, but I think that with human, that with the addition of the human component, it'll really make it great. And I think you really still need that component to make it translational, because nutrition is so complex that you know, I view it as a tool that can really aid and really empower dietitians in the way they give treatment, so that they'll know better what to advise. But I think you still need, many people will still need that human component, and so, you know, like in many other places where we're seeing AI enter the field of medicine, I think AI are not going to replace doctors, and similarly AI is not going to replace dietitians. I think it's going to be tools that really can empower and help guide decisions, and this is actually the approach that also the company Day 2 is going to really not just throw the app on people, but really to find a way to also have it be used as part of a consultation with dietitians.
So, Professor Parent, you had mentioned something, you know, interesting in your talk, that, you know, what if you get into a situation where the algorithm, the AI says something, and that's different from what the nutritionist, the dietitian, physician, healthcare professional, food professional would recommend or would do. That raises an interesting both ethical and legal dilemma, right?
It does. And I think that's also a perfect example of why we need to retain the role of the health professionals and the dietitians. I agree with Dr. Spector that choice is critical, but choice without shared decision-making is not really choice. And what I mean by that is someone to be there to help put the recommendations in context of your personal values and beliefs and goals. And I think to the greatest degree possible, we need that person there, whether it's in these digital boxes like we have here, or in person when the world allows for that again. Or I acknowledge that this creates access limitations for some people who may not be able to either afford or get to clinics even in a virtual space. But in those cases, there have to be, I think, nutritionists, clinicians built into the development, design, and delivery of the services, even if it's on the back end, even if it's just sort of in a Q&A fashion for a mobile app. And that can be determined at a regulatory level, right? This is the kind of policy that can say, once this hits the market, then it has to be supported by licensed, trained professionals.
Okay, thank you, Professor Parent. We have about 6 minutes to go. So I wanted to ask one more question from the attendees that was called from the attendees, and then give each of you a chance to just have a closing statement. Just give us a summary of your thoughts and sort of the way forward when it comes to translating and applying these new approaches. So the last question is, I'm a master's student writing a thesis on machine learning and precision nutrition. I found precision nutrition suitable data sets hard to come by. Do any of the panelists have any suggestions on available data sets? I'm currently using NHANES, but this is more suitable for epidemiology. Any thoughts from anyone about that?
well, the problem is that it costs millions to collect individual level data. And at the moment, you can request some of the data sets from some of the papers, for example, that Eran and I have authored to get an idea of the sort of variation. But the companies that fund it are not going to easily all that extreme fine detail information easily. So it is difficult. There are, I think, some public data sets, and Eran can probably answer that better to people to train on and practice. And that's probably the place to go, because enhanced data is definitely not the place to do personalized nutrition. So I definitely wouldn't start there. And you may just want to start doing 10 people yourself with 10 glucose monitors. Get your own data.
Any additional thoughts?
I would encourage you to use the NIH reporter tool if you haven't used it yet. And you can use that to query our NIH database of all funded projects and publications. And there's a matchmaking tool. And from there, you could probably start talking to people who are addressing maybe some of the problems you're thinking about, and perhaps collecting the data you're thinking about to get you going on perhaps the most appropriate databases you need. So it's the NIH reporter tool.
Thank you, Dr. Peng. Okay, so in our last 4 minutes, I'd like to give every opportunity for just very brief comments, closing comments. And let's go in reverse. I guess we ended with the introductions with Dr. Peng. So maybe Dr. Peng, you want to offer some closing thoughts?
So my closing thoughts is I would encourage everyone to think about using system science, modeling, and simulation to really design your experiments and design your approach to understand the gaps in the system that you're trying to understand to create your testable hypothesis. So I call it the analysis first method. And to broaden your research team to include the broad spectrum of diverse expertise, and especially the end users of whatever it is that you're creating, so that they're involved in providing you the feedback, and to encourage you to use credible practice in how you develop your models and simulation, and take a look at the 10 simple rules I talked to you about on the IMAG wiki. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Peng. Dr. Horn? We can't quite hear you. Okay, looks like you're not coming through. Okay, we'll jump back to you, Dr. Spector.
Yeah, just to say that precision nutrition, I think, is reality now, and there are products on the market. It's going to get better as more and more data comes in, and the key thing for anyone starting this is to work out a way of making sure that you can precisely look at the response of an individual, and as I said, you collect as much data as you can, you freeze it away until these markers get better, and the whole area, isn't one thing. You've got to look at multidisciplinary methods of doing it, multi-omics, and putting it all together is the key to this. So I think it's a super exciting time, and we're moving away from just the genetic era to this multi-omic era, and that's really going to be a game changer. And we're going to start seeing the real practical side of this being obvious within a year or two.
Thank you, Dr. Spector. Dr. Segal?
Yes, I again, I would fully agree with Tim, and I think I think there's a big difference in how precision nutrition is being done now in the past several years compared to maybe 2 decades ago, when maybe I think the science is much more rigorous now. I think we're measuring. We have specific markers to work against, like in the work that Tim and I have been doing. We look at responses to individual meals, and that gives us a real grounding in the data. And I think the usage of multi-omics is really making it basically another data-driven science endeavor to nutrition, like it's been applied to many other fields. And so I think this time, I think it's real, and I think the data is supporting that, even now in real life settings with products out there that really are already helping people. So I think it's now becoming a solid, rigorous science that will probably be here to stay.
All right, thank you, Dr. Segal. Speaking of systems, looks like we have the audio systems fixed for Dr. Horn.
Yep, great. Thank you. So I wanted to build on what Dr. Peng was saying, that really the importance of looking at the whole of systems, the whole of systems model, and all of the different layers that impact an individual's nutrition, and determine what is accessible, what is actionable, what is realizable for an individual. And I really want to emphasize the importance of considering the environment that they're embedded in, and the environment that determines what is accessible to them. And there are a lot of data sources out there that we can be combining, but we also really need to be, as Dr. Peng was saying, bringing together these interdisciplinary teams who have these different levels of expertise and can see how the interactions occur across these different levels. And whether it be in a research that's focused on using AI to dig into data streams, or if it's a traditional nutrition study like the question that was asked, in either of these situations, we can bring in these we can bring in these measures of the environmental exposures and the environmental accessibility that really determine what's feasible for an individual.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Horn. Professor Parent?
I just want to acknowledge that I dodged the question about explainability, but that was just because I wanted to answer the previous question about the relationship between people and machines. To talk about explainability, people, including clinicians and other trained experts, can't always explain how they arrive at their conclusions. So I want to acknowledge that fact. But the difference is when we have both a machine giving a recommendation and a person giving a recommendation, the person who is receiving that recommendation can easily query the person, right? And then they can have a conversation about what this means. And so it might be just as good as saying, look, this machine is like a second opinion. Here's my opinion. Here's why I think this way. And here's why I think the machine might think this way. And here's what I recommend based on who you are. So this, I think, is an important component to the future of precision nutrition, is having people involved in the system.
Thank you, Professor Parent. And Dr. Pronk, since you started off with translating and translation, maybe you can finish off our session by translating what we should take from this session.
So in 20 words or less. So I would say that first of all, I would like to sort of echo the comments from Dr. Peng and Dr. Horn, that from my perspective, there is an important component here, that perspectives matter, and it depends who you are when you look at this system as a whole. So making sure that there is relevance to the real world user is very important. I would also think that that we need to take a critical look at outcomes, and that, you know, in the context of precision nutrition at the individual level, we should probably look for outcomes that reflect successes at the individual level instead of always looking for population average improvements. How many successes do you generate using these kinds of methods? And in order to get to those kind of results, you know, what does that mean for the approach that you take to get the translation to happen from the cell all the way to the real world application at the level of people as well as policies and organizational change factors. So maybe I can just leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Pronk. So our time is up, and we tried to address many attendees' questions. Apologies if we didn't get through all of them. It's always, there's always not enough time to discuss everything involving the translation of these important issues, important precision nutrition and computational analytics. So I wanted to thank my distinguished panel members for their time and their expertise and their insight. All of you are doing tremendous work in and around the area of precision nutrition. So we are grateful that you were able to join us in this discussion. And hopefully this was useful for all the attendees and the audience that are listening. So this concludes section 5 of our precision nutrition meeting. So the next step is we have a very brief break. You can again visit the poster session if you would like to. And we're going to start up again at 3 o'clock. And at 3 o'clock, I'm going to be joined by my co-chairs, Elizabeth and Jose. And we're going to provide a wrap-up of the 2 days and a discussion of some of the outstanding questions and maybe a look into the way forward. So thank you again for joining this section, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes or so.